Just a quick question for these guys. To start it up. It's you. Yeah. Okay, sure. LLC. Yeah. Members, let me make sure.
Hey, Ty Ben, are the microphones on?
She said she had me muted and she was gonna turn me on. Okay, we're good to go. Welcome to the Advanced Plans Committee meeting of March 9. We've got a long agenda today, so we're gonna try to keep moving at as brisk of a pace as we can. First, I would like to have a roll call. Dual here. Warren is not here. Joe Johnson.
Here.
Joe Johnson is here virtually. Fox. Hartman. Miles is not here. And McKay is not here. So we have a quorum of 4. Okay. We need now to have a motion for approval of the previous minutes.
Motion to approve.
I second it.
Okay. Fox moved and Hartman seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Oppose the same sign. Motion carries. Thank you. So now the next item on the agenda is a court ruling on conditional use cases, and Scott is going to make a presentation to us on that.
Well, actually, I'll just go ahead and get the conversation started. And then I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to take it from here.
Okay.
But this case is very interesting. It happened very recently, went to the Kansas Court of Appeals, and it has the potential to change how conditional use cases are processed for both the city and the county. So we thought that it was something we need to get on your radar as soon as possible. And so Jeff is here to provide you with an overview.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, this case came out of Finney County, and Finney County had a procedure where it authorized its BZA to approve its conditional or deny its conditional use cases. There was a case that was approved and challenged. The district court upheld the approval and went on up to the Court of Appeals in a 3-panel decision by the Court of Appeals. 2 overruled it and 1 dissented. We're not sure yet whether they're appealing it to the Supreme Court, but we've got about another week or so to find out, and then the Supreme Court has to agree to hear the case before, and then wait and hear what happens from that. But basically, what they interpreted Kansas statute to basically say that a conditional use case must be reviewed by the governing body's planning commission and then voted upon by the governing body itself. Our zoning code says that the decision of a conditional use case is final upon the MAPC's vote unless one of 6 items occur, such as an appeal or a protest and the other ones. So what we're going to have to do until such time as the Supreme Court rules otherwise is we're going to have Scott as a director who has the authority will be appealing every conditional use case till we get our code changed, and we'll probably wait to find out whether the Supreme Court hears and what they rule. But in such time, all of the conditional use cases will be, going to the government for, a vote.
The governing body being the city council, or is it the Court of Appeals?
No, governing body and the Board of County Commissioners.
Okay.
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 And why does Scott have to appeal it?
Well, because our code right now says the only way it can go to the governing body is through an appeal. And so until we amend the code, we're trying to bridge the gap, and we'll have a one-page document where Scott can, and it says appeals should be in writing. So we'll have a one-page document where Scott can sign it and throw it in the file and to go forward. Now, we are in the process of notifying those who have applied for conditional use to let them know this is going to be the case, because it's been the practice for quite some time that, the MAPC is the final arbiter on the case, and unless it was appealed or protested.
So where there's a city, like where Mays or Derby comes into play, then they become the deciding body.
No, they
County?
have, if it's in the ring of influence, they have 30 days to let us know what they're doing. I think that's one of the conditions. It's in Article 5, D6, I think, if I'm not mistaken, where those 5 or 6 items are listed. I just don't have them all memorized right now. So.
And in that case too, their role is advisory. I mean, they can change the amount of the vote, but it's advisory. So it would need to go to the governing body, which is the county commission anyway.
So this is really more of a procedural thing, as I understand it. We've been doing business one way, but in the future, if this thing were to get through the courts, we would need to pass these on to the governing body.
We're going to start that practice immediately because of this decision. And yes, it is primarily procedural, but it's a little bit of a heads up, because it will require, if this continues, will require a zone change code amendment, zoning change code. So.
Okay, and that would be done by the governing body, right?
That's originated by you guys, and then they approve the decision.
Okay, right. Okay. Is there anything else on this? Any more questions? It's informational. We don't need to take any action at this point. Okay. We'll move on to number 4. This is Old Town overlay changes.
All right, I will go to the podium in just a moment. Let me check and make sure. Mary, did we get copies of this staff report distributed in the packets? Okay. All right, good morning, everyone. Scott Wadle from the Planning Department here to cover this item. So before you is a DER case, and the request here, the recommendation is that you would initiate a map amendment to the Unified Zoning Code. And this is per the section of the zoning code that allows MAPC to initiate these changes, either map amendments or text amendments. Now, so the recommendation again is that you would recommend to the MAPC that they would initiate this. So the situation here and you'll see in the staff report, I don't have a PowerPoint on this one because we've been working on it until just recently, is that Old Town Overlay was created in 1991. We'll talk about what, and in there, in the Old Town Overlay, it explicitly prohibits the use of tattoo parlors. And it's and on the staff report on page 2, in terms of land use, Old Town Overlay District prohibits the following uses, either permitted or conditional uses: tattooing and body piercing facilities and any sexually oriented business in the city. So that's 1991, that's established. In 2022, there's a tattoo parlor that opened up in the former First Gear running store, if you're familiar with the Old Town area. So that became vacant, a tattoo parlor moved in. The planning department received a complaint from a member of the public indicating that this tattoo parlor was operating in violation of the zoning code. We substantiated that, our staff substantiated that. There was some dialogue, though, on the city's part about the appropriateness of how this would be resolved and whether it's appropriate to allow the business to continue. As part of that deliberation, there were discussions at the Old Town Association, which is a group of residents and businesses in the area. They considered the implications of this tattoo operation, whether or not it should be allowed to continue. And they actually, what they recommended is they recommended that enforcement, they recommended that it be continued to operate in Old Town. However, as part of that recommendation, they also indicated that they did not wish to see additional tattoo operations take place in Old Town. So that's kind of where we find ourselves. At bottom of page 1 is the analysis section. It talks about the overlay, which is we refer to as the Old Town overlay. Talks about how on beginning of page 2, it has implications that governs exterior appearance of buildings, also land uses. We've pointed out the text in terms of land use, but I would highlight that there's also regulations related to signage, also related to exterior appearance of buildings. So towards the middle of page 2, the proposed option would remove the property from the Old Town overlay district, and then in its would also place a protective overlay on the property with restrictions that are similar to the Old Town overlay. One thing I should mention about the Old Town overlay that's fairly unique is that the Old Town overlay allows individuals to enter into a property owners to enter into a parking agreement with the city of Wichita in order to satisfy the off-street parking requirement. So as you're familiar with most classifications in the zoning code require off-street parking. Obviously in Old Town, there's not a lot of space with some of those older buildings. And so Old Town functions with a collective parking district that is operated by the city, and property owners and businesses are able to enter into a contract with the city of Wichita to provide and satisfy their off-street parking requirement. So that's a couple of the notes then, is that the property owner would likely need to continue an agreement with the city of Wichita to meet their parking requirement. And also that depending on how it's done, it may require an administrative adjustment for the property to allow 100% of the parking to be off-site through a parking agreement. There's a number of attachments with this report, and I'll refer you to those just briefly. On page 3 of the report, you'll see in red is outlined the areas that are within the Old Town overlay district. The property that we're talking about in this specific instance is the one that's highlighted in green. So it's kind of towards Douglas along Rock Island Avenue. And in fact, if you recall, if you're familiar with the area, there's the former First Gear site, which is now the tattoo operation, and that is on the west end of the building. On the east end of the building is a bicycle shop, Heartland Bicycle. And then above it, there's a second story where there are offices that operate as well. So flipping then to page 4, this is from the zoning code. We've highlighted in blue the use restrictions. I read those to you earlier. They were listed in the staff report, but there's where you can see them in the context of the code. Also on page 5 then is a discussion about the agreement for a shared parking plan. And this is in a different section of the code, but it talks about how that can be permitted. And then on page 6, starting on page 6, are select pages from the zoning code, because we didn't want to include all the tables of what land use requires, how much parking and whatnot. But this is just text that talks about just parking, what's required and how it can be shared or not shared. So I know this is a little bit of a tricky item, but wanted to bring it to you as soon as we could to try and resolve the situation. So if, and I'll talk a little bit about the implications of the actions. If you go with the requested action, then we would aim to have the public hearing at the MAPC meeting on April 13th. In order to make that happen, we would look for you to, the full MAPC, to initiate the action on March 23rd. And in order to meet the public notice requirements for the April 13th meeting, we would have to send it to the newspaper and distribute the letters to the stakeholders within the required 200-foot distance on or around March 21st. So it'd be slightly before. So what would happen is that if the item did not happen for some reason, we would have to put deferred or withdrawn on the agenda for the 13th. So with that, stand for any questions.
Yes, Ms. Fox.
I'm very curious, if this is a zoning violation, why would we apply to override it? And I understand if the Old Town Association wants to keep this business, but only this business, no other tattoo parlors, then that seems really confusing. Why wouldn't the owner be the one filing for the zoning change?
Yes, good question. So in this case, in this situation, I think that the city has been very sympathetic to the implications of this business that apparently did not know that they were moving into an area where tattoo operations were restricted. And so because of that, I think that that's why we're looking at this action today. Now, in terms of the implications of this one property being allowed to have tattoo operations within the Old Town District, there would be some risk in this instance that it could be perceived as spot zoning. And in that case, what would spot zoning essentially is you're giving an advantage to an individual property or location that is not available for a rational reason to the rest of the area. And so that would be a risk.
Any other questions?
Well, and I guess my concern is when we know somebody's watching this and they're the ones who submitted a zoning violation, I feel like somebody's gonna, if we as MAPC say, oh, skip our rules right now because we want to help this one business, and we know there's somebody out there who's watching and, you know, put in a code violation, I think we'd really be at risk for them following up and saying, hey, preferential treatment. I don't know if I want my name on being the one to initiate that action. Even though I recognize attitudes about tattoo parlors are different now than they were in 1991, well, then let's just say all tattoo parlors can be allowed.
Right.
What happens if we do not initiate it?
If it's not initiated by the MAPC, there would still be the option for the property owner to initiate the zoning map amendment request, so zone change request. Also, there's been some discussion about the possibility of the city initiating that through instead of MAPC. So, but I can tell you in the code, it's pretty straightforward. You handle it every week or every other week is one that the property owner would apply for it.
Are there any other questions? I have a comment and a question. First of all, if their defense is they didn't know about this, and generally ignorance is no defense under the law, right? But I guess my question is, in these overlays, they don't have to be contiguous. I don't understand how all this came about. And I'm looking at this map on East Douglas, the farthest east square. Would that happen to be the Anchor Bar and Grill and the Hellbaum Tattoo Parlor?
It is, yes.
So, yes. And it is way removed from being contiguous to this. And even on these other locations right to the north of this area, it looks like starting at the tracks, the first block would be contiguous. The second one would be, and then the third and the fourth are not. And then there's one over here across the street from, I guess what would be Larkspur there. How did all this come about? What's the rationale for that?
It's a good question. And what first I would just point out that it's the Anchor is the one that's furthest to the east. The tattoo parlor is not covered by that one. Since we're already talking about one tattoo parlor, I want to make sure
Okay.
we don't have another one in there. The second part, which is to your question about the geography of where these are and how they get arrayed in such a dispersed pattern, I think it opens up to a debate about what truly is considered Old Town and what fits the characteristic of Old Town and what doesn't. And I think that that's something that the MAPC is asked to consider when they take these actions, because my understanding is that the one for certainly the one for the Anchor was expanded after the original Old Town overlay was created. So I think what you're looking at are expansions that have happened over time.
Just looking at this, to me, it begs to the question of spot zoning.
I have some juice.
So, well, is there any other further discussion on this?
Did Joe have a comment? I didn't hear what he
Oh, I'm
said.
sorry, Joe.
Just a second. I'm really confused. And I don't think I don't think I support this. But I can change my mind.
Are there any other questions or comments on this issue? Okay, then I think I need to entertain a motion to approve the. Oh, yes, there's nobody from the public here apparently. Is there anybody remotely from the public who would like to speak on this issue? If not, I bring it back to advanced plans. I would entertain a motion to approve this request. It could die for that, or do we want to entertain a motion to deny this request?
I'd make a motion to deny the request that MAPC initiate action on this matter.
Do I hear a
I'll
second?
second.
Okay, Fox moved and Hartman seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Oppose the same motion. Okay, the motion carries.
I have a question. Did you motioned to deny or you motioned to send it to MAPC?
To deny the request for MAPC to initiate the zoning change.
Are we okay with that procedurally? Okay. Very good.
Do city council members have our phone numbers? Are we? I strike that from the record.
Okay, moving on to the next item. We have the College Hill Neighborhood Plan RFP, and this is an overlay, right?
I can answer that question. So this is an item that came up. This is Scott Wadle again from the planning department. This item came up at the MAPC meeting last week. And while you were considering, I think it was last week, you were considering the Belmont parking lot discussion. So as part of the initial discussion about the Belmont's application more than a year ago, there came up the idea about a College Hill neighborhood plan. And so what we've put together is an RFP, a draft RFP, which is what has been handed out as part of your packet, and I think distributed as part of the agenda packet ahead of time. And this RFP, my philosophy with putting together an RFP is that you state what the issues or the concerns are and kind of the lay of the land for the area, and then you have the consultants propose what they think is the correct process, the best fit in terms of a process and a product that would be delivered. So what we are asking for out of this RFP is that, number one, that they would do a neighborhood plan, and then it strongly suggests that a overlay district would be developed as well. And we would be open to whether or not an overlay district would be proposed or at least drafted up, because we really need to see from the neighborhood plan about whether or not that's something that the neighborhood residents feel is needed. We've gotten indications that it is, but we want to see what the majority of the neighborhood sentiment is. So on the page 1, it talks about an overview, gives you the purpose of it. The overview introduces the two things, the neighborhood plan and the overlay district. The budget is proposed to be $50,000 to undertake this work, and that's based on what we've done with our most recent plan updates, South Central, also Delano. Community need. These are some of the themes that we've seen emerge from conversations about the Belmont and other actions in College Hill. Also talks about the location, the history of it, kind of giving folks context as well as the context of the zoning cases. On page 3, at the bottom is facts and figures just related about the area. 4 is then links to where they can find additional information. And then bottom of page 4 is the objectives and the scope of work. So it gives the boundaries, the time frame, and that there's not a definite one, but we want to see what the schedule is that the consultant teams propose. And then we do expect that there would be a steering committee and also a technical advisory committee that would be formed as part of this process. It's kind of standard procedure. And then we identify the scope of services in terms of what's deliverables. On page 6, we talk about the information that we can provide and the services that we can provide. And then on page 7, you can see that there are the evaluation criteria that would be used to evaluate the proposals. Bottom of page 7, all of page 8 is the order and materials that should be submitted as part of their proposal. And then on page 9, we have information about process. And you can see that some of the dates are coming up quite quickly. So we may have to adjust these dates depending on how soon we can get the requisition and RFP out. And then the rest, 10 and 11, are standard information that goes into RFPs. The process for this generally is that we first have to enter a requisition. So we're working on getting the funding source identified for this, and then the RFP would be issued. We would see what comes in. There would be a committee that would review the proposals and rank them. There possibly would be interviews for the consultant teams to determine which one's the preferred one. And then recommendation, depending on the contract amount, would either go to the city manager or would go to the city council. So with that, I'll stand for any questions.
Questions? Ms. Fox?
I understand why you wouldn't put a timeline requirement in terms of we want you to start July 1, but do you ever put a time completion like this would have to be completed within a 6-month window once you're selected, or?
Yeah, well, so what we do is when the proposals come in, they generally specify, we look for them to specify what time they expect to get different phases done and when they expect to wrap up. Because for them, time is money as well. So they want to get it done in a not rush through it, but at least get it done in a succinct amount of time. We will include their proposal as the contract. So the contract will refer to the scope of work which is the proposal. And that is what the standard they would be held to.
And then the funding really does come from tax dollars, is that correct? I
In
mean,
this case, that's where I would expect that it would, yeah.
so how do you prioritize requests for this kind of support from neighborhoods?
It actually comes down to the budget process. So maybe at your next meeting, you will have an opportunity to look at the budget request proposals that the planning department has made. It'll also be an opportunity for you to make recommendations to the governing bodies about what you think should be in the approved as part of operating budgets. So it really depends on which ones get funding from the governing bodies.
Thank you.
Are there any other comments or requests present or remotely? Joe, do you have any comments?
So I think it sounds very good. I think it's something that's needed, and I hope it gets approved and funded.
Ditto, I think it gives agency to a neighborhood association that isn't benefiting from a homeowner association. And I think College Hill is one of those neighborhoods we want to protect its character and give them the chance to say what they want their neighborhood to be.
Is there anybody from the public present or on remotely that would like to comment on this issue? I just am wondering, first of all, did we do something similar to this in Delano where it was an existing neighborhood that we put a protective overlay on?
Yes, so that started, the typical stages for these are that there's a need that's identified for a plan for a variety of different reasons. Could be based on infrastructure, could be based on land use, could be anything. Then a neighborhood plan is undertaken. That gives us an opportunity to get everyone around the table to identify what the needs are, where there's consensus about moving forward. And out of that one came the idea of land use and creating a distinct district. And that's where the overlay emerged. And then the overlay process, it can be recommended in a plan, but it is typically undertaken as a separate or follow-up initiative that then requires its own deliberation and discussion at the MAPC level, at the governing body level. So when you adopt a plan, you typically are not also adopting a overlay district. That's usually a separate vote that needs to be considered.
Okay. So in my experience, protective overlays have generally occurred in zoning requests, zoning change requests, or in new subdivisions. And in this case, and in Delano, they are occurring after the fact, if you will. There's no new development per se on this. I'm just wondering, so we're going to hire consultants that are going to tell us what the terms and conditions of this overlay are going to be, right?
Well, actually, they'll be responsible for drafting it up, but it should be a combination of the neighborhood association and the residents and stakeholders and businesses that tell us what they want the neighborhood to look like in the future, what they want it to be in the future. And then the consultant is responsible for interpreting that into something that can be codified into code to help provide direction and expectations.
I guess, again, my only comment would be, I hope we get plenty of input from the neighborhood, because to me, this is something that should, if not initiated, certainly have a lot of input from the affected parties here, and not necessarily city government.
And I do too, because the last situation I want to be in is recommending something to you and then having 100 residents from the neighborhood come up and say, that's not the right fit.
Well, and as I understand it, really, our planning staff isn't deep enough or experienced enough to guide these things, nor do we need to bring on a full staff member to do a one-off project.
Exactly.
So this becomes the way we can give some technical support to that neighborhood, but not draw from limited staff time in the department.
Exactly.
have any kind of a neighborhood association?
They do. They've got a neighborhood association and I believe they have meetings either quarterly or every other month, and they typically are pretty robust from what I hear. So they do certainly have an active association.
And we already, I mean, the boundaries have already been established.
Yes, so their boundaries go up to Central, and they're pretty contiguous with the major streets. So Kellogg on the south, Central on the north, Oliver on the east, and then Hillside on the west.
So does that neighborhood association have the power of restrictive covenants like a new development would have?
No.
That are enforceable?
And that question has come up, and that will come up again with short-term rentals, one of the other items. But for the restrictive covenants, again, are private agreements, and they're typically done at the beginning when one individual or organization
Right.
owns all the land, because otherwise you have to get the individual property owners to sign in on it at a later
It
date.
would be
And it's-
possible, would it not, Scott?
It would be, I think it's possible that it would be challenging in order to convince everyone to do it, but it is possible.
Is there any further discussion on this matter?
No, but Bob, I would like to thank you for recognizing I was here and giving me a chance to speak. I appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'll try not to forget you.
You did not. Thank you.
Okay, do we have a motion to approve this item?
And Mr. Dool, on this one, we're just looking for feedback. So
Oh,
if
okay.
you guys have any strong
Okay.
sentiments, we're
Or are you
okay.
gonna take this to the full planning commission?
I didn't anticipate doing that. This was just because it came up at the previous MAPC meeting. So I wanted to make sure that members of the planning commission got an opportunity to see it. If you'd like for us to, we can certainly add it on to the next agenda, but I didn't foresee doing that at this point.
I don't know that we need to do that, but on an item such as this, I think it might be important that the full planning commission at least be aware of the action that we took. And of course, they could go online and look at our minutes, I suppose, anytime, but we might want to mention that to them.
Sure. What we can do, if you don't mind, is we could get a copy of the draft minutes and we could actually put that in as part of the agenda packet for the full MAPC.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Okay, thank you
Work on
very
doing
much. Next item is short-term rentals, regulatory changes update. Scott, you're on again.
Yeah, I apologize. This is see if I put everyone to sleep here. So this one is short-term rentals. This is one that we've been talking about for a while now. And again, this is a situation where I think there's been an emphasis on getting to a resolution on this. So I'm going to refer to the staff report. We have a couple graphics, but most of it's going to be through the staff report. So what we are, the proposal here, request or recommendation, it's presented in both ways in the staff report, is that you would recommend that the full MAPC initiate an amendment to the zoning code for this. Again, just as we talked about with the Old Town situation, you would approve of the zoning code amendments that are presented, and I'll walk you through all of those. 3, that you would endorse the municipal code changes, and that includes the licensing program and also the party house ordinance. And then number 4, that you would also, that the MAPC would also make amendments to their policy 20. And that is a lot of material. And so I will walk you through that, and then we'll see where you're at after we get done with that. So we have handwritten numbers on these printed packets, and those are the numbers that I'm going to be referring to, because it's actually, the packet is a collection of documents. So I want to make sure everyone can be on the same page. So page 1 starts kind of the background and takes you through the timeline. Page 2 at the beginning talks about, again, continues that timeline. What I would point out here is that this started in 2021, and it's been to the city council for a workshop in December through February. We made presentations to the district advisory boards. So the next one then is at the bottom of page 2. We've got the community mission, and I think this is why this discussion has been so interesting for our community, is that it touches on so many different points of the city of Wichita's mission. So safety, economy, infrastructure, and living well, quality of life issues. We talk about the number of short-term rentals. We estimate that it's around 500 at this point, and that the rate is about $90 a night, not including the cleaning fees. We also estimate that 90% of short-term rentals in Wichita are single-family homes that are rented out entirely without the owner present. Page 3 talks about the existing regulations, and I would simply boil it down to if you want to have an owner, if you got an owner or manager on site, you can ask for a conditional use to be a bed and breakfast. That's an option. If you don't want to have an owner or manager on site and you want to rent it for less than 7 days, then you would need to get a rezoning to allow you to do it as a hotel motel. Or option 3 is that you would rent it for at least 7 days. And then it would be legal, same as if you were renting out a house for 6 months or a year. Our enforcement at the bottom of page 3 talks about how we do enforcement. I'm not going to go in depth on that one. Page 4 talks about other communities, and we did a survey. We've reached out to other communities. I'll tell you, just as I've mentioned before, communities are custom tailoring these solutions. There's not one size fits all application throughout the country. We're finding that there's a significant amount of custom tailoring to the specific needs of the community. And I think a lot of that has to do with this land use being relatively new to a lot of communities. Page 4 is where we start on the proposed changes, and these are different than the ones that have been discussed. They're modified from the ones that have been discussed at the DABs and at the city council. So this is so I'll be explaining how they're different. So in the zoning code, so we've got information here about the zoning code changes, the proposed changes. So Article 2 is where our definitions are located. So this would add, and the text of these changes are attached as part of this packet, but I'll just go through the highlights right now. So Article 2 is where definitions are. We would add a definition for short-term rentals, and we would make modifications to existing ones to clarify that they're not a short-term rental or the relationship between them. So bed and breakfast would be rolled in with short-term rental, but we would explicitly state that hotel motel is not, a short-term rental is not a hotel motel. I mean, we don't want anyone going in and getting a short-term rental and then starting to open up a Days Inn or something. Article 3 are the use regulations that specifies where they're allowed, where they're not allowed. In general, they would be allowed, short-term rentals would be allowed by right in every district except if they're in SF10, SF5, TF3, MF18, or MF29, and they're not owner occupied. So if you've got a carriage house or a basement apartment or something that you're renting out on Airbnb and it's owner occupied, you're there, you can do it by right. You would not need to go through a zoning action. But if it's not owner occupied and it's in one of those zoning districts, those are the ones that would need zoning action. Article 5 would development review. This would create a new section of the code that would allow for administrative permits. We currently allow administrative permits in the zoning code. It's associated specifically with wireless communication facilities. This would create a separate section of the code, would take that language from the wireless communication facilities, put it in there, and also add language that would allow for administrative permits for short-term rentals. So we're moving some things around to consolidate it, to make it easier to read the code, make it more streamlined. So what would happen is with this section at the top of page 5, it talks about that an administrative permit would allow short-term rentals to operate in those instances where they're not by right. So if you're operating one, you want to open a short-term rental, you're in one of these 5 zoning districts where they're not allowed by right, you want to operate it without the owner occupant there, then you submit an application to the planning department for an administrative permit. So it doesn't have to come to MAPC, it comes to the planning department. Now, as part of that, you'll see the second bullet point is that a written notice would be required to be distributed to all abutting and adjacent properties. So if there's, and this includes properties across the street as well. And Ty Ben, if you can pull up those graphics, I'd like to show those at this point, or we can go back to them. But what would happen with those notices is that if more than 50% of the land area represented by all those properties, if the owners of more than 50% submit a protest against the application, then it would cause the application to come to the MAPC as a conditional use. So in that way, we're hoping to allow for more non-controversial short-term rentals to be approved administratively, but for the ones where there is more controversy, that it would come for deliberation and public input and everything in front of the MAPC. And they would have to go through the full conditional use process with a distributed public notice, all of that.
So is this sort of your tact to address the density of short-term rentals to a certain extent? In other words, if I live across from the yellow thing right now, I might say, okay, that one's okay. But then if next week another application comes for the house next to that, I might decide, hey, wait, we already have one, that's enough. Is that kind of the idea?
Actually, that's not the impetus behind it, but I think that it does get to that point for neighborhoods who feel like maybe they've met a threshold or whatnot, but not necessarily. What it was really intended for, the purpose behind it is because if there's 500 units and we're all of a sudden instituting a licensing program and we've got zoning change requirements, I'm not confident that the planning department or the MAPC has the capacity to process 500 applications in even 18 months time. Because if you simply figure we've got 24 meetings in a year, divide 500 by 24, I think it would overwhelm the system. So in this way, we're hoping to be able to approve the majority of them, as long as they're, again, not controversial, anticipating that they're not, administratively, and then save the ones where there's debate for the MAPC meetings. And this really, truly, I'm hoping this is a dialogue, because part of what we're figuring is 50%, is more than 50% the right percentage, right? We were looking at simply a majority of the folks around there. Does it go up to 75%? Does it go down? We thought greater than 50% was a good starting point. The other thing that I would point out is I've got family members who live next to a church, right? The church is huge compared to the residential parcels next to it. If we're taking the total land area of the properties that touch, in their instance, if the church files a protest petition, they're more than 50% of the land area because their lot is so big. So we did it this way because it's an easy calculation for us. In GIS, we can add up the area of all these properties real quick. It's actually easier than if we do a 200-foot radius buffer and all that kind of jazz. So that's why we base it based on property size, land area. Ty Ben, thanks for pulling these up. This is an illustration of how this would work out in a kind of more suburban context where the streets are a little bit curvy and you've got cul-de-sacs. Let's go to the next one then. This is how it would work in a more traditional area. So you can see that we count the properties across the street because we don't count the street itself. And in this instance, they're all about the same size. So in order to get above 50%, it looks like you would need to have at least 4 of them. If more than 50% of the land area, you'd have to have at least 4 of them that would file a protest. And the protest would go to the city clerk, just like the regular protest process that we use for other zoning cases. Now, the other thing to point out too is that people are sensitive. We've heard public comments, a lot of public comments about sensitivity about the addresses and locations of these. The owners of short-term rentals, they're concerned that they're fully furnished homes. They're out there, sometimes not occupied, and that if the addresses were widely known, they're concerned that there could be break-ins that would take place. So as part of this process, what's proposed is that the letters would be distributed to the adjacent owners, but that there would not be a sign requirement for a yard sign like we do with other application developments. Let's see. Going back to the staff report, page 5, there's a time that's specified. I don't recall it offhand, but we could look it up. Then again, there's the opportunity for an appeal, and the appeals would come first to the MAPC would be the first process. So, okay, that takes us through kind of the highlights for the zoning code. I'm more than happy to take you through the specific language, but any questions on zoning code before we go into licensing?
We have any questions from those present on the committee, or Joe, do you have any questions?
Are these being done right now illegally?
Are they being thinned down in terms of?
No, are people actually renting spaces using this concept?
Yes, I would say it's proven to be fairly popular in Wichita just based on the
Well, that's
information.
what I mean, but are we doing anything about it? Is there any restrictions of it? Where do we stand with it?
Yes, currently there are restrictions, and there have been restrictions even before these started, because remember, the zoning code was never developed with the intention or forced, thought of short-term rentals coming in. And so short-term rentals for their entire duration here in Wichita have been regulated by the zoning code, which in many instances for residential zoning makes it illegal unless you're renting it for 7 days or more.
So is that being enforced?
It has been up until we've started these discussions. At this point, we're not as proactive on the enforcement of these because of the dialogue that's taking place about the resolution. And we've heard multiple comments at the public meetings from short-term rental owners expressing, hey, can we get this resolved, because we really need to be able to figure out one way or the other what we're going to do with this property. And I think that that's part of the reason why there's an emphasis on trying to get to a resolution here too.
Scott, did you say they had to be less than 7 or more than 7?
At least 7 days or more.
For a short-term rental?
That's correct. In most residential districts, in the most common
Right.
residential districts.
When I've used them in other cities, it's been for like 2 or 3 nights.
Yes. And I think that's been the most common reason why these are turned into us for enforcement, is because of a violation that they're not renting it out for at least 7 days.
Because if you go to a basketball tournament or something, you want the whole family to go. It's a good thing to do, but you don't want to stay there 7 days.
Yeah. Not unless you got a really good team. They're going to go further in the tournament.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
Other questions or comments from the public remotely?
Well,
Yes. Sure.
So the question is whether or not, for the existing short-term rentals in the city, would they be grandfathered under these regulations? And great question. And that actually gets to the licensing piece. So, as part of the license is what would require folks to come into compliance. And in there, we can specify an amount of time that they would have to enter into compliance. And there's been some dialogue internally with staff about what's an appropriate amount of time. And 6 months is, I would say, is more typical. However, in light of the zoning process, I'm wondering if we shouldn't consider something longer, even say something like 18 months. And here's the reason why, is because a zoning action, if you have to do a conditional use, let's say you file for the administrative permit, and that takes you a month maybe to get all that kind of sorted out. Well, if you get kicked over to being a conditional use with the public notice and with having to go to the elected body now, it's going to take you 2 months to get through that process at least. So with 500 units, and who knows what percentage of them would turn out to hit the protest percentage. It's just a matter of how many can we process through in an amount of time, and trying to juggle that.
Also, would a process exist, or could it be brought up again and after that? So let's say that you do this, your neighborhood decides it's okay, and then a couple years later, you've got a lot of different neighbors, they don't like it anymore.
So the question is, if it's approved through this process, administrative permit or through the conditional use process, can stakeholders in the area come back later and protest it and reverse basically the approval for it to operate? And the answer to that one is no, because it's a zoning action. It's very similar to zoning actions that MAPC does on a biweekly basis, and that once it's in place, there's a protest period, and after that's done, once the decision is made. Now, of course, local government always has the authority to come back later and do a zone change, initiate a zone change. We've seen like Midtown was rezoned that way after a neighborhood plan, but that's very rare and often happens just on a neighborhood basis.
Are there any other questions or comments on the issue? Ms. Fox?
I just want to go on record as saying my biggest concern about short-term rentals is it takes livable properties out of action as housing for our community. And I think the housing need is strong enough. And of course, an existing home with existing infrastructure is always going to be less expensive than something we haven't built yet. So it just want to make sure we're all conscious that every short-term rental is taking one more housing unit out of use for housing for our population. And given incoming companies that have employees that need a place to live, I just hope we're not dooming ourselves to a greater housing problem.
I think
just
that's
want-
a great
yeah.
point. And
I just wanted to point out, we still got the licensing part to go through. And so there's a lot of meat and potatoes in there as well.
And if we're going to have it, then let's make sure they're licensed and make sure we have adequate enforcement to enforce the licensing requirements. Amen.
Okay, I don't believe this is anything we need to take action on, is it?
Oh, I'm
Pardon.
sorry, Mr. Dool. There's still more to go through.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So the next section then is on licensing.
Oh, okay.
And the licensing, so it would establish it as part of the municipal code. And again, just like the zoning code changes, this is attached as part of your packet. All of the short-term rentals would have to be licensed, and this license is based on short-term rentals per dwelling unit. So if you had a duplex and you wanted to operate both sides of it as short-term rentals, you would have to have a license for each one. Similarly, same thing, if you've got an apartment, you've got multiple units, each of them would have to be licensed. There's an good neighbor policy that would be required, second bullet point. You'd have to be in compliance with codes and inspections based on complaints, which is number 3. This is a change from what was originally taken out to the DABs and city council, in that inspections would not be required in order to get a license, but the inspections would be based solely on a complaint basis. That there would be fines and enforcement actions, that there would be an annual fee of $225 per short-term rental. And the reason why we arrived at that amount is because we looked at the cost, the annual cost for a monitoring system for short-term rentals. We also looked at the cost of a part-time staff person in zoning enforcement to do the enforcement on these, and the equipment such as a truck, computer, all the stuff that goes along with a position. And also we looked at an estimated amount of how many inspections would need to be done and the ability to cover the cost of those inspections. So, so we ended up at 225. That they would have 18 months is currently what's drafted, but again, this is subject to change and discussion. But it's a starting point for the timeline that they would have to get into compliance. Again, inspections to be on a complaint basis, that the maximum occupancy would be limited to 2 adults per bedroom plus an additional 2 adults. This is, an adult is defined as over the age of 12 years old, and there's no occupancy limit for children. And I believe that there was some discussion about whether or not this would apply to owner occupied or to non-owner occupied. And I believe the intent was just for non-owner occupied based on some court rulings, but that's something I need to reach out and get clarification on. But and then gatherings would be limited to 2 times the maximum overnight capacity, occupancy capacity, or 20 persons, whichever is less, and they would have to disperse by 10 p.m. So that's to address concerns about, you know, large parties or something taking place. And then again, the licensing is attached as part of this packet. From there, I'm going to keep rolling because there's another section of the municipal code that's proposed, and this would be a municipal code for party houses. And for that one, I didn't put a lot of detail into the staff report, but I will refer you instead to the section of the code, and that's on page 36 of the packet. And a nuisance party is a social gathering of 5 or more people on a residential property that results in any of the following. And they've got unlawful sale of or consumption of alcohol, assault or battery, property damage, littering, some other things I'm not going to mention, but parking in a bad way, firearms, fireworks, all kinds of stuff. And then on page 37, that's unlawful. And then the police can order people to leave. And that's, I think, the real thing behind this is that it gives the police the authority to disperse and address the activity immediately. And this is modeled on ordinances that other communities have put in place. I think Topeka is the nearest one that's done that. So that's the municipal code party houses. And then on page 5, you can see that we've got an MAPC policy statement number 20. This is your policy, the MAPC's policy that requiring signs to be placed, development application, those red and white signs to be placed on properties. That is a policy of the city council that was approved by city council and the MAPC. We would, as part of this action, we're recommending that you would amend that to clarify that short-term rentals that are seeking an administrative permit would not be required to post that sign on the property. And so with that, then you can see the attachments. I could take you through page by page, but I think we've covered the highlights. And so the recommended action on this one is that you, the Advanced Plans Committee, would recommend that the full MAPC initiate an amendment to the zoning code, approve the zoning code amendments, endorse the municipal code changes, the party house and licensing, and then amend the MAPC policy number 20.
Question on notification. You have your little outlines on the properties, and we talked about the land use and 50%, but that notification is to the property address or to the property address owner?
Property owner at this point. And as part of your packet, I'll point out where that is. It is page 32 in your packet. You're going to see a reference to the owners filing the protest petition. In terms of the notification, I'm not finding that immediately, but it's nearby. It's on page 30 is the highlighted text talks about mail to the owners about all properties.
Are there any other questions? I apologize for cutting you off short. I
No,
see we
it's-
do need to take action on this to recommend this to the MAPC. Yes,
I have a question. What are the differences between current city ordinance on nuisances and what's being proposed in the party house?
Sure. So the question is, what's the difference between party house ordinance and the codes that are already on, regulations already on the books for the city of Wichita? And Jeff, I'm going to look to you, but I'm going to provide my answer, which is that my understanding is that the existing codes require multiple offenses to take place at a property before they can be addressed by the police department. The party house nuisance parties would allow the police to disperse those activities upon finding them.
That's my understanding. That's all I knew about it as well. So
Sharon Dickraft from the law department was here earlier remotely, but she had another conflict, so she had to get off.
any other questions? Yes,
Got one here. So, should the advanced plans they recommend the MAPC, is that process then going back out to district advisory boards for more input feedback?
Not at this point. We could always receive direction to do that, but at this point, what it would be is we would likely schedule it for the MAPC to consider whether or not to initiate it. And then once the MAPC is initiated, we would set a public hearing date for the MAPC to take public comments. And at that point, we would look for them at that meeting to take action on revisions to the code.
That then goes to city council?
It would, yep, it would go to city council after that. And I would also point out that the planning commission advises on the zoning code and on the MAPC policy about the signs. But the ordinances for the nuisance party houses and the licensing program is really something that you can advise and comment on, but it's not something that you have direct authority over. So that requires city council action on its own.
okay. There's no more comments. We are asked for a recommended action to initiate the amendment of Unified Zoning Code per Unified Zoning Code Article VC2. And second, to approve the Unified Zoning Code amendments. 3, endorse the Wichita Municipal Code changes, and 4, amend the MAPC Policy 20. Do I hear a motion to that effect?
I move to recommend moving this on to MAPC and initiating the 4 items listed.
Second.
Okay. Hartman moved and Mr. Johnson seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, same motion. Motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the next item we have is LLC applicants and information. Kurt Sponsel, the Assistant Sedgwick County Counselor will guide us through that.
Yes, good morning. Thank you. Kirk Sponsel, Assistant County Counselor. Just briefly as a roadmap, I'm going to discuss concerning this LLC information. The roadmap would be standard practices, maybe state considerations, and then some legal considerations. So first and foremost, in looking at this, starting with the application itself, with what potentially might be required on the application, our Unified Zoning Code does briefly address applications. within section 5A2, it indicates that applications shall be submitted on forms provided by the department head responsible for accepting the application and in such numbers as required. So obviously that's pretty bare bones. There's a little bit of discretion there with what goes into the application forms themselves. With that said, our current applications don't specifically list out for LLCs provide every single member that has an ownership interest in the LLC. I have looked through several other applications of Kansas jurisdictions. I obviously haven't gone through every single county, every single major city, but I did try hit the bigger ones in terms of both counties and cities. And what I found from what was available, none of the other ones I reviewed required a specific listing of all the owners of the LLCs. It's just kind of the generic, list the owner of the property that is going for this application. So as for certain state considerations, Kansas statutes lay out the LLC establishment in KSA 17-7662 and sequential statutes. I will say that within some of those requirements for Kansas LLCs, per their annual reports, there isn't a duty for them to list the members with at least 5% of the capital interest, but that is for the Kansas LLCs only. I say that because there is a distinction. That requirement of the listed owners is not required for foreign entities. I would also point out that there are certain states within the US that don't require a listing of owners or members of the LLCs, types of essentially anonymous LLCs. So that is a situation within other states. For legal considerations, so with that said, obviously a blanket requirement that you list all owners or members of the LLC would extend beyond what is required by the Kansas law in their handling of it, and would go beyond some certain other state considerations. Now, I'm not going to sit up here and opine if there's other language you could do, if you can soften the language, list any, if you are a Kansas LLC, list owners or members who have at least 5% interest, or, can you please provide the owners or members of an LLC, but not make that a requirement, just soften the language. At this juncture, I'm really not going to delve into heavy detail on how the wording could or should be worded, because for legal considerations, a lot of this traces back to the golden factors. All roads lead back to the golden factors, right? So in considering this issue and considering if this information should be requested, there could almost be a two-tiered analysis here. So the first would be, what benefit would there be in the application itself? Would there be any information garnered just in essence by the listing of the owners beyond just the registered agent that would assist MAPD in ensuring the integrity of the application, or in providing any additional information towards the review, anything like that? So that would be a first consideration, is does it provide anything in the analysis of the application itself? The second tier of analysis would be, how does this impact the golden factors? Specifically in reviewing the zoning amendments and reviewing the conditional uses, case law has kind of said, hey, these are the considerations you guys need to make. This is the general guidelines for which you should be reviewing these applications. So what's the basis for asking this specific information? By knowing, instead of just the LLC that's making the application, by knowing each specific owner behind the LLC, what golden factor does that really contribute to? And I raise these questions because there could potentially be risks. And I don't really want to be up here today and going and discussing, yes, this golden factor could be impacted by this, or no, it couldn't be impacted by this. I don't want to be giving legal advice or legal considerations too in-depth at this setting. Now, what I will say is as part of the application process, once again, going back to the first tier of analysis, if you're asking for information and if the applicant does not provide it per our code, that application is returned to them as incomplete. So the question would be arised. I mean, an example would be on future forms, theoretically, the question could be put in there, what's your mother's maiden name? Well, what benefit does that have to the application itself? Now, that was obviously an extreme example, but in a situation like this, the question would be, once again, what benefit does this pose in, or what benefit does this add to the process itself? And if an entity comes back and they say, we don't want to provide this list of members, we don't have to, we're a foreign entity, we're not required to by state law, we don't think that this helps you at all in your analysis, then the argument would become, is our process unduly burdensome? Are we extending beyond the appropriate process? So that would be part towards the tier one. As for the tier two, with the analysis of approval or denial, especially concerning the golden factors, the question would be, if you don't have a good basis or a good reason in connection with the golden factors, then why are you asking for or considering this information? Is it because you're going to be viewing certain applicants more strictly or more harshly than other applicants? That would be another question that could potentially be raised. So in the end, especially dealing with my focus being on zoning amendments or conditional use considerations, you know, what benefit does this information bring? And as an alternative, do we already have certain things in place that would mitigate our interest in that information? I.e., if we're concerned about who's doing the buildings, you know, are they doing it up to standards? Well, then questions need to be raised. How is the plating process not addressing that? How would our building permits not be addressing that? So these would be questions that would need to be raised in considering this question. Once again, I'm kind of hesitant to be talking through it in detail at this juncture, but this is kind of a broad brushstrokes overview of the analysis.
Questions, comments?
I just have one comment. You mentioned that in some of these foreign entities aren't required to provide that information.
Yeah, and by foreign entities, I was kind of going off of state law language. That's you know, for example, LLCs registered in another state. So when you look at the annual report that's required, they say, you know, list the members that have 5% of the capital interest. And then in parentheses, even on the application form itself, it says for Kansas LLCs only. And then when I looked at the statute for their acknowledgement of out-of-state entities, it doesn't require listing the members specifically. Now, I don't know if there would be documents filed potentially that might contain some of that information. I don't know if sometimes entities do that regardless. But what I would say is the annual report is where Kansas requires that listing of ownership interest, and it's not required for the out-of-staters.
So I think I started this line of questioning because when an applicant for a zoning change is someone who may be known to have violations on other properties, whether it's code violations or operational violations, or where they've had a house that's been reported as a nuisance, et cetera, et cetera. It's very, very difficult to identify a bad actor when they apply for another zoning case. But I think what I'm hearing you say, we don't have any law that's like some communities will not issue a new building permit to any entity where there is an existing code violation on an existing property. And that to me, you know, holds accountable the people who need to be held accountable. But LLCs, they really help you hide who owns. And I understood that in America, we list property owners so that someone can be held accountable, but the LLC sort of allows that to be skirted. And if taxes are paid, then we don't care anymore, right? So anyway, you told me that we really can't ask for it because even though we don't have adequate zoning enforcement, you know, that would, and landlords don't have enforcement, I think is the other part. So another tact is necessary to tackle that problem, I guess, in a nutshell.
I think there's certainly different ways to approach different issues. I don't know.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for your detailed response to this. And particularly, I think the answer may lie in the golden rules and how it relates to that, or a specific reason for needing to know more information about a particular application. I would say I would expand this to other entities, not just LLCs, but it could be a corporation, it could be a partnership, it could be a sole proprietorship using a different name than the individual. And I was concerned about foreign entities, and I think you've addressed that. Does anyone else have any questions or comments on this? If not, we will thank you for the information you've given us, and we will receive it and file it.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Moving on. We now have Scott presenting performance measures for the department.
All right, so Scott Wadle from Planning. We've got a PowerPoint for this one to take you through it. We've got the handouts for those who are here. You can also see. So these are just performance measures. We put these together for the budget every year. And so it's a good opportunity to reflect on what we've accomplished over the course of 2022. Next slide. So this is a graphic. You may have seen it before. It shows the number of cases that the planning department has processed. It goes back to 1985 up to 2022. And you can see that we're on the upswing, and it's a pretty significant upswing. And we'll show you some of the details, but you can see it. We hit our peak right around 2006, and it's been down, ups and downs since then, mostly down, but you can see we're on this long trajectory going up. Next slide. So these are the different types of cases that we reviewed in 2022. So we have zone changes, and we have, I would point out that zone changes at 11%, community unit plans at 4%, plan unit developments at 3%. These are all cases that you see at MAPC, as well as, and typically referred to as zoning cases. You can see subdivision plating cases made up 24% of the work. We had a lot of plating cases that came through and lots of lots that were created. Next slide. This is a table that provides you a little bit more detail on these. All of those that are highlighted are ones that are up or close to being up or matched with ones from the years prior, 2021. You can see that at the bottom, the total is 754 cases that were processed. If you want to match that or exceed it, you'd have to go back to 2012 in order to find that. So we're doing the most cases that we've done in at least 10 years. Next slide, please. This is total number of non-subdivision cases at MAPC. You see this every month, but this is how we closed out in December. You can see it was very close to 2021 and above 2020. So we were same song, different verse, just that we're staying busy, and we're keeping you all busy as well. Next slide, please. Here's a graph that shows how the caseload went throughout the year. You can see that 2022 is the green line. It's fairly bumpy with a huge spike at the infamous October meeting. That was pretty interesting. So, and that is continued, and you'll see it on our next item with the updates continued into this year of spiky caseloads. Next slide, please. Subdivision cases, so finished with 78. We've also started counting the number of lots. You'll see that in a new report, but quite a few properties were created as part of these processes. Next slide. Again, this one was spiky as well. In 2022, you can see that they were started off very high at the beginning of the year and then tapered off, but with a number of spikes along the way. Next slide, please. So staffing, we're going to roll into that and how we finished out in 2022. Next slide. So this is the org chart. We've got the 4 divisions. You're familiar with that. And then the positions listed. I'm going to go ahead and cruise right past this. Go to the next slide, please. And in 2022, we had, I was shocked when we counted this up, but we had 5 positions that were filled in 2022. And I had kind of lost track of how substantial that was for a department with 20 positions. The other thing too is that we're actively hiring a couple of positions right now. So we are continuing to move forward on staffing. Next slide, please. And just to point out that really this is in many ways a young department. You can see all the positions that we've filled just in the 2 years, 2020 to 2022. So we're doing a tremendous amount of work, and there are people who are learning a lot doing that. Next slide. In terms of our finances, this one, I apologize, I don't have the most recent information. Next slide, we'll just go through just a general overview. We're still working on getting this updated, but again, we operate under the interlocal agreement 50-50 city and county, but first we collect from the fees and applications. There's reimbursement for zoning enforcement. And the next couple slides are graphs that I need to get updated for you all. But I'll just give you in short, this is 2021, but in short, very reflective of what we saw the previous year in terms of revenues, also the same for expenditures. But what I would mention is that in expenditures, our biggest expense is personnel. We can go to the next slide, type in, but our biggest expense is personnel expenses. And in 2022, we refunded back a pretty sizable chunk of money to the city and the county because we had vacant positions, which resulted in salary savings, both for salary and benefits. So that's what went back to the city and the county. So that'll take us to the last slide, and that's where I'll stop. See if there's any questions on that, any of the information.
So are most of your positions salaried, and that's why you had money to give back with vacancies? Because the workload seems like it would have required extra time or overtime.
Yeah, the majority of the positions that are processing and doing the staff report, so writing those, going out and doing the field research, those are exempt positions. So you're exactly right in that they're putting in more hours, or we're throwing people from advanced plans to do those cases. We also have very fortunate and so thankful that by the city and the county, they've both approved adding the 2 new positions in 2023. So we've got 2 associate positions that are new, and we're working on filling. And then also that they approved $15,000, so $7,500 from each organization to fund temporary staffing. So that would allow us to call in Bill Longnecker or other folks to come in and help us out on an as-needed basis.
Any other comments? I'd just like to offer this, that I believe that the planning department is an excellent example of the consolidation of city and county functions. It has worked very well, and hopefully a model for some more to come.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bob, would you like to name any of those, or just kidding?
No comment.
I think the law department.
Okay, project update. Scott, you're on again.
Sure. I'll just, in the interest of time, I'm going to go through this very, very quickly. And we're just starting out at the beginning of the year. On page 2, you'll see that we've got a really spiky chart on here. That means that in January, I think it was, we had an agenda load that was very, very high. We've had low agendas, as you'll see on today's agenda. There's not that many cases. But because that spike was so high, it's caused our average actually so far this year to be higher than it was for last year in terms of number of cases you're considering. So we'll see how that pans out. Same thing with the bar chart below. On to page 3, same story, very spiky. Lots of cases came in for subdivision cases. So working through those. Page 4, this is a new figure that we're starting to track, and that is the number of lots that are created through the plating process. And year to date in 2023, we have had 931 lots approved, and last year we had just under 2,000. So we are almost halfway to what was approved last year. And I think that reflects the size of the plats that you all have been asked to review and comment on. On page 5, again, this is our tracking of when caseloads at the MAPC exceed our typical staff capacity to process them. We've got those highlighted. And so you can see some very large agendas in January. Page 6 is our staffing situation. And I'm pleased to say that all of the divisions are fully staffed except for advanced plans. And there it's 50% vacancy at this point. So we're working on filling those. Number 7 is short-term, just project updates. So short-term rentals, we talked about that one. Solar, I would just point out that we've got a meeting scheduled I'm scheduled to present at the Sedgwick County Association of Cities. It just happened this week that we were able to get that scheduled. So I'll be presenting again the changes in the zoning code for comments there. And then I expect that we'll do briefings with the city council and get it scheduled for county commission to vote on. The next one then is nightclubs. We've put that one kind of on hold for right now. I really want to get that one done. So later on this year, we'll pick that back up. Daycares, we're working on that. That has been to the city council. It is now, we're working on getting it scheduled for the county commission meeting. I believe March 22nd is the date that we've identified. So working on that. And then the places for people, land banks, zoning code, duplex, no updates on those at this point. So with that, I'll stand for any questions.
Do we have any questions for Scott on his comments? We thank you for that. Now we'll call for any public comments, either present or remotely. If you want to speak, you're limited to 3 minutes. Hearing none, is there any other business we need to bring before the committee today? If not, we will stand adjourned. Next meeting is April 13th. Thank you.